Good evening, everyone, or afternoon, I guess it is. My name is Ryan Maloney. I work here at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. Excited to have you here tonight. Thank you.
I see you.
For those of you who were here earlier this afternoon, welcome back. How many of you is this your very first time here at the museum? Wonderful. Cool. So make sure you stay in touch. We do about over 100 public programs here a year, lectures, concerts, presentations. Folks that you see here are involved in some of those, and we would love to have you back. So please consider coming and hanging out with us. All of our programming is free and open to the public. We're able to do that because we have some really generous donors that understand and appreciate our mission to preserve, promote, and present music. So those of you who would like to be counted among those donors, we would love to have you. We make it very easy. On your way out the door, there's a little cash box. You can drop some money in. You can use our dip jar and just make a little $10 donation. Or you can support on our website, jmih.org. So we make it really easy. We also send out a weekly newsletter on Fridays. You can sign up for that on our website as well. Again, the website is jmih.org. So for those of you who would like to keep in touch, you can do that. Today, we continue a partnership with the New York City Winter Jazz Festival, which is going on. How many of you have been to other Winter Jazz Fest events this weekend? Wonderful. So yeah, it's an amazing event. We're glad that and so happy that it's back in full force. And it brings together some amazing musicians, and it gives the jazz community a chance to gather and celebrate and reconnect. So we're excited to be a part of the Winter Jazz Festival this year by offering the Talks series here at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem today, and then again on Tuesday we have another 2 events. So we really encourage you to come out for those as well. We're going to get things started I'm going to just pitch it right over to our host and our moderator. Please welcome Nate Chinen.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for being here. It's really nice that at this point in everyone's Winter Jazz Fest experience, you all saw fit to join us uptown on a Sunday afternoon. We're going to have some fun up here. So as Ryan said, my name is Nate Chinen. I am a somewhat newcomer to the jazz radio ecology. I'm now at WRTI, which is Temple University Public Radio, based in Philadelphia, jazz and classical station. Before that, I was at WBGO for probably about 6 years. So that is the sum total of my jazz radio journey. But let me tell you, I've learned a lot in that time. So those are my credentials as moderator here today. But I'm sitting next to 3 people who have really deep insights on this matter. And I can see you all. There's more than a few people in this room who also have deep insights. So I look forward to the Q&A that we'll do toward the end of this panel. I'm going to start on the end here and introduce Matt Fleeger, who is the program director at KMHD in Portland. Matt has been involved in radio since he was a teenager, and brings a lot of energy and contemporary vibes to this job, and also has a really interesting perspective on the sort of university licensing situation that some jazz radio stations deal with. So does Josh Jackson, who is my boss and my colleague at WRTI.
He always does that.
Yeah. Some people seem suited to that word. You know, my kids actually refer to him as Josh the boss. Josh is the associate general manager at WRTI, which again is jazz and classical, which presents certain challenges that I'm sure we'll get to. Prior to that, Josh was in Virginia doing a lot of other radio stuff that did not directly involve jazz for the most part. And before that, a legendary tenure at WBGO in Newark Public Radio, where he created the checkout and a series of live recordings from the Village Vanguard that I think probably most of us remember very fondly, and a lot of other cool stuff. So that's Josh. And next to Josh, yes, is Keanna Faircloth. Let's give her a hand. Keanna is also a former colleague at WBGO, where she was host of Afternoon Jazz. She is the host of the Artimacy Podcast and a regular now contributor to NPR Music's All Songs Considered podcast. And Keanna is also an artist. I always forget the artist relations at Yamaha here in New York. So that's our panel. And I'll remind you that the title of this panel is State of Jazz Radio in the Digital Age. So that makes me think of a few things, including the State of the Union. And you know, every time a president delivers that speech to a joint session of Congress, there's always that one word. The State of the Union is blank. Usually it's strong. You know, sometimes, I don't know what the other, sometimes there's something else that's a little more barbed. I think during the Trump era it was like challenged, or I don't know. So I'm going to task you all with a presidential task. The state of jazz radio is what?
Yikes.
Yeah, I'm putting them on the spot. So, Josh, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. The state of jazz radio is, I would say, in transition. I know that's more than one word. I'll say that there's a lot to be thankful for in terms of like the ability to reach new audiences on digital platforms. But you know, as I sort of say frequently, our digital future is also based upon our analog past. And so we effectively are about the audio modality, and we're storytellers, and we're connectors, and these are the kinds of things that no matter how your work is distributed, if it's creative work, it is not necessarily in stasis, but it is, you know, creative work is very similar, and it's just that the platforms are changing. So, I mean, I would say that, you know, we've got our challenges. You know, as a format, jazz radio, especially here in the United States, is not, it's not very cohesive in some ways. It's not very collaborative in terms of collective impact. There are lots of people doing very interesting things, but sometimes they're in crevices and in the shadows a little bit. So, you know, there are some ways that we have to figure out a way forward, you know, and but also not to sort of lose the things that we're very good at.
Thank you. Keanna, what do you think?
The first, I guess, word that came to my mind was state of jazz radio is perplexed, I guess, right now. I think there's a lot that jazz radio is contending with as far as the digital media platforms that are options for folks. People have the ability to literally curate what it is they want to ingest at any given moment. And so radio has to then I guess, figure out what's going to grab the public. I think radio, jazz radio, has a responsibility to really be the tastemakers and remain that and be the educators and the institution that folks are looking to or should be looking to get their cues on what they should be listening to. But quite frankly, I feel like jazz radio is losing a lot to, you know, what's stopping folks from listening to, you know, their favorite musician who has a podcast, Questlove, for example. Strong following, you know, people want to hear what the musicians playing the music have to say. And so radio is contending with that. And so I think that is the perplexing challenge.
That's a good word. And we will return to that in a moment. Matt, what's your word?
I would say the state of jazz radio is on the upswing. I feel like there's an enormous amount of potential right now, especially for radio. In the digital atmosphere, what we find is a lack of authenticity. The algorithm cannot be authentic. But the human being and the ability to curate in an intimate way is something that is very special and very intrinsic to radio. When we listen to the radio, we typically listen by ourselves. And because we listen by ourselves, it's just you and that disembodied voice talking back with you. And if the person and the presenter is good enough, what they can do is they can take that monologue and disguise it as a conversation. Mm-hmm. What we work on, and I'm talking from my perspective at Portland and KMHD, but what we attempt to do is we want to turn somebody on to something. You know, I see the DJ's purpose on the radio station as being the person who can influence how the audience will experience the next song. And so there's two ways to do that. You can do that with cohesive mixing, and you can do that with language in your voice. And so what we concentrate most on is what's coming up next, staying in the moment, trying to build on the experience of listening to that next song. And if we've turned you on to something new, then we've done our job and we've created a relationship between us, that intimate relationship where you have learned something about the music and you might have something new that you're a fan of. And we see this as a sort of reciprocal relationship where we can influence you to maybe go out and purchase music, go attend a live show, and thus support the artists that are creating the music, the labels that are helping the artists, you know, they're the people who are in the band, the touring schedule. And this is all the more important now after 3 years of this pandemic. You know, we're here for the first time. Winter JazzFest is back, seeing audiences attend shows again. But the biggest thing I'm seeing is the artists are feeling inspired again. You know, they're in front of big crowds. That's really inspiring. And so I see that as the unique role that radio can fill in the digital environment where we're all clamoring for a more authentic experience. And I want to talk about AI a little bit today, but I won't do that now. But I think there are some things that are happening with AI and radio that are synergistic to a degree, and where humans can interface with AI in a way that makes it a little bit more, have a little bit more humanity than just being algorithmic.
Wow. The next question was written by ChatGPT. No, I'm kidding. All right. I'm curious to hear where that's going. But I want to go back for a moment to Keanna's perplexed comment, and especially, you know, because the second part of the title of this panel is In the Digital Age, right? But the first part is State of Jazz Radio. State of Jazz happens to be the name of the main Spotify jazz playlist that is geared towards discovery, right? And I thought it might be helpful to read just the first 5 tracks on that playlist at the moment, right? Number 1, Indie, Braxton Cook. Number 2, Head Bedlam, Christian McBride's New John. Number 3, Herbie's Dance, Dafur Yosef with Herbie Hancock. Number 4, Lady by Ezra Collective. Number 5, Black Heroes by Brian Blade, John Coward, Myron Walden. So this is a playlist that I imagine has probably a fairly limited amount of human intervention in the curation, but some, right? There's an influx of product that is reaching Spotify, and at any given moment, the stuff that's in this playlist is brand new, and in many cases not being played on terrestrial radio. So what are your thoughts about this? What is the challenge of that? What is the opportunity of it? Is a playlist like Jazz Currents on Apple Music or State of Jazz on Spotify doing a better job in many cases than jazz radio in terms of getting the new stuff out there?
Well, I'll say this also. Placement on playlists like that are determined also by certain industry concerns. So let's be clear that the newest version of what used to be called payola in broadcasting is still happening on DMPs. So, there's probably a reason beyond the fact that he's a great musician that Christian McBride is appearing at the top of that. Let's be clear.
All right.
So I just wanted to put that
Sure.
in place because that's real. But to actually answer your question, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no, Nate. I think, sure, they are putting out significantly more music than we are able to program on, in our case, at RTI, 12 hours of FM broadcasts that we're locally producing, and also even on the syndication that we're doing on our HD hours off terrestrial air. So, but also we have some different concerns, in terms of audience. It's not everything everywhere when you're specifically dealing with that medium. So the other issue that, say, jazz radio has is that we don't own these assets. We don't own the music. Could we effectively do some show where, say, I host a program on AMP or on Anchor? Sure, I could do that, and then let Amazon and Spotify and the labels mostly take that money, and I'm working for them, So, that's sort of the deal that we're making. So we don't have certain abilities to use the other platforms to spread that music digitally. It's not that some of us don't have a desire to do so, but the sort of the guardrails of what we do as programmers for an audience is we're broadcasters, and that word broad has a very deep meaning for us. And so, we are looking for ways for people to engage with this music, and sometimes that's through the humanity of the host as the value proposition. Sometimes the music can speak for itself, but in a lot of ways, there are lots of different kinds of demographics that will not appreciate Ezra Collective, and there are some who will. And so trying to find the right balance where you're literally broadcasting to lots of people who will then hopefully, after some time or right away, support you so that you can continue to invest and do this great work. That's the calculus here. So yes, there's more music on these platforms. How it's presented has some significance, as Matt was saying. There's power in the DJ, a good one, or someone that you can actually rely on as someone who has listened to this music, has spoken to the artist, is embedded in the culture in a significant way, and believes in the actual power of the community, the tiny who's in Whoville, but they're loud when they're together. So that's kind of the way I'm sort of viewing it. They're winning in some ways, and in a lot of ways they're not. There's going to be people who want, as you called it, a more authentic experience, and a human moment.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading off that, that playlist, partial playlist, I was thinking about what you said, Matt. Context and the voice that leads in and the voice that back announces, and what. Not only what is this, or a sort of mechanical recitation of sidemen, but like why am I hearing this? What am I supposed to listen for in this?
Make me care.
Yeah.
What's significant about it? And I think for me, when I'm listening to my favorite DJs, I want to get to know them as a person, not just as a radio host. I want to know, what do you like to listen to? What are your interests? Why should I be trusting what you're saying right now? I think that's what's most important. And to Matt's point, about the experience that a host gives you, as far as their taste, is so important. It's not just about, no slight to program directors or anything. It's not just about the taste of the program director. It should be, a collaborative experience between the host and the program director. It shouldn't be an automated thing. A lot of stations are going that route where they're, just rinse and repeat kind of thing happening on the air.
Well, that was my next question, actually. I know that there's a big move towards digitization in public radio and in jazz radio. Yeah. And I know that that is a tool that can be wielded in a lot of different ways. But, you know, in some cases, we have radio stations where the playlist was determined, you know, hours or days ago, and the voice tracking was done, you know, not live. So it seems to me, and I'd be curious to hear whether anyone has a differing opinion, that if, as a radio station, the differentiating factor from a streaming service is human presence, but you are minimizing the human presence, both in the curation and the actual physical, literal presence, yeah, then you are steering into the skid and not actually playing up your best features. Am I right, or am I missing something?
I think that's absolutely right. I think, you know, one of the things, and I've got some of my DJs in the room tonight, and, you know, we don't do a music director at KMHD. We purposefully decided we're not going to have a music director. Instead, what we have on the air is 28 different music directors. And my job as program director is to find people who are passionate about the music that they can present on the air, and then trust them enough to do their thing. And if we do that, our DJs constantly are falling back in love with what they're doing, but they have the creative freedom to choose their music, which all of us who loved music in the 70s and 80s on the radio, that's what DJs did back then. What happened in the 90s was a very misguided thing, in my opinion, and it was for the ease of the program director to say, I'm going to automate your playlists, and this is what you're going to be playing. You no longer have a choice. Your personality is no longer a part of what's being picked. What I want to see is, again, that relationship built with the audience between our DJs and them, and they are there to serve. So they understand that coming in, that they're there to serve people. And so there's a tremendous amount of training that goes into this before you can do it on the air. But once you do it, you're there to be the type of person I'm here to expose you to some music that I think you might like. And again, to create that relationship with the artist. We don't care if you go and spend some time with us and then go listen to albums all night that you found through listening to us. Right. That's still listening to us in a way, you know what I mean? And that's spending money on music. That's hopefully going out to buy tickets, go to the venues, and support this culture and industry that we're all part of.
And you're going to come back for more because it made you want to explore. That's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
You know, as we talk about that ecosystem, many of us have spent the last couple of nights, you know, in very crowded rooms, sometimes struggling to get into crowded rooms. Just an incredible amount of energy at these shows. And some of that is, you know, finally we're back, you know, but some of it is where the music's at right now. And so I wanted to ask you all whether you feel that, you know, jazz radio, and this is a very broad term, is capturing that energy that we see at Winter JazzFest, at a festival like Newport when it's popping, you know, at JazzFest in New Orleans. You know, there's so much life among audiences right now. Is jazz radio capturing that?
I hope we are. You know, Alex Newman is one of our DJs. He hosts a show called New Jazz for Lunch every afternoon, and I feel like out of everybody, he captures it the most because he is the guy who's playing stuff that's brand new, always that Spotify playlist, you're going to find stuff before it makes it to that playlist on his show. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to shows coming into town, he is the person you're going to turn to most often to, like, if you want to really discover and dig, that show's on at noon every day, and you can listen to it, and hopefully will drive you to a show. And when we support or sponsor shows, our main goal isn't to make money off supporting or sponsoring shows. It's to drive audience. The more people in the seat, the better off we are, because that supports our ecosystem, you know, in Portland.
I think, you know, really, what would really help jazz musicians, I think, is if local radio stations supported those that are actually out there gigging. And I think, unfortunately, in some places that isn't at the forefront of the leadership at jazz radio stations, that isn't at the forefront of their minds, that is what should be important, that radio support those artists that need people to come out to their gigs. A lot of times folks are stuck in the past. And while there's value there, of course we need to hear those artists that paved the way and have passed on and made way for the musicians that are actually gigging now. We also need to hear those artists that are gigging now. We need to make sure that they're being supported on the airwaves, especially in major cities.
And that reminds me of something that I've talked with you about, Josh. A jazz radio station will always play the greats, right? That's it's kind of it's the core, right? But when I first got to RTI, you were talking about a tick that drives you crazy, that announcers will say, oh, the late great so and so, and the reason for that. Could you explain why that particular terminology is?
Well, first of all, I mean, it creates something in the listener's mind, and that's when you're a broadcaster. One of the things that I'm not going to dog jazz broadcasters. I'm really not, because I am one, But I will say that there are deeply ingrained habits among a lot of jazz broadcasters who are fans of the music, but don't understand the actual role and significance of what broadcasting is. And it's hard for people to understand that they're entertainers also, and that there are things that you say to an audience that, affect them in ways that you're probably not thinking about unless you've been doing this for 26 years or so, So creating that kind of mentality, these people are still alive, They have left the physical plane, but they are deeply embedded in the core and the culture of what this music is, and so that will always be important. They are still present for all of us who love the music, so stop talking about them like they are no longer here. That's one of the big, ticks. There's a few, but, we'll stop there.
We've been talking a bit about supporting current musicians and supporting a scene. We've been talking about ecology. I want to acknowledge, calling a little bit of an audible here, but I want to acknowledge that when we talk about jazz radio, this is a global proposition. And we have more than a North American perspective. And so just before I came on, I had an introduction to one of several distinguished jazz broadcasters in the audience today. Giles Peterson is here with us. And I imagine that if you're here at this event, you probably don't need me to introduce him, but he is a distinguished broadcaster in the UK, and very kindly said that if I wanted to call on him, I could. So Ryan, do you have, can we bring that mic out? He has to leave a little early, so I can't wait till the Q&A session, but I wanted to give him a chance to weigh in on, come up, and talk about, let's give him a hand.
Thank you.
So you've heard what we've all been talking about. I imagine that there were at least a couple of moments when something ran through your head, so feel free to jump in on any one of these points or something else.
Well, first of all, jazz in America is different, right? I mean, this is it, and there's a whole network of stations here that do jazz, and that's sort of there's a whole sort of world network. In the UK, there is no jazz radio station, so there was the odd jazz show, and I remember. For me, when I first came to the States, working for Prestige, I was only like 22 years old, and they invited me to go through all the archives at Berkeley to go through stuff. And I listened to K-Jazz first time I was ever in America, and it had such an impact on me listening to this. Just hearing jazz all day long on the radio was amazing, and it had a big impact on what I went on to do. As part of one of my big influences. There's so many things to sort of break into. I mean, I do think that one of the things we can learn from for all of us with regards to jazz and trying to reach new audiences, because I think at the end of the day, you know, the echo chamber's getting smaller, people have got more choice, and it's like, how do we bring the new ones in? And so for me, it's a bit like, how did jazz festivals manage to reimagine stuff? I think, you know, I look at festivals like Montreux in Switzerland, or there's so many jazz festivals in Europe, and they were getting tired because a lot of the greats were passing, and there was no one really to champion the new generation. And in the end, they were running out of artists. So finally now, I mean, I worked at Montreux for 10 years, and it was quite interesting because I was a fan of the festival. It's probably the greatest festival in Europe. And I was like very keen, this is like 25 years ago now, to come in, and I would organise a night every year in the Miles Davis Hall, and I would bring in the new sound of the electronic scene, which was influenced by jazz, call it acid jazz or the beginnings of trip hop and all these groups. And I brought people over like JD and Madlib and the Gotan Project and Carl Craig and his own orchestra and Fontella Bass with the cinematic orchestra. And at that time, the festival was very unsure about whether it made sense or whether it was relevant to jazz. And in the end, I think I was proved right in the sense that these festivals have to see what is coming through and nurture it and bring it to itself, you know. And so I think that putting that into context of today, in a way, is how do you encourage the new generation of artists and musicians and DJs and broadcasters into our world and make it comfortable for them to be able to grow and to, in reverse, gain their audience. And again, connecting that with festivals, it's all about the live experience, right? We're talking about you know, how all these musicians are so happy to be performing here at Winter Jazz. You can see it, the audiences are really so excited about it. And I think that right now, if you are a small radio station or any radio station, the thing to do is to have a public-facing side of your station. And that is to be able to put on as many events as possible, to bring in and nurture all the emerging artists, make them feel part of what you are. And I'm all about live broadcasting. You know, I can't stand I do a radio station called Worldwide FM, and obviously during the pandemic, many people couldn't come in the studio, so everyone was doing it virtually. Everyone was recording their shows. And I think that we dropped significantly after the pandemic as a station because we didn't switch immediately back to live broadcasting and really give people that sense of community and connection, which is what is magic about radio and which is where it lacks with regards to all the streaming services. So it's how do you get that balance between really effective broadcasters and curators, exciting young energy, and you know, great music. So and community. That's how you grow, in my opinion. That's my 5 pennies worth, I think.
It's interesting that you know, because we're talking about curation to a certain extent. We're talking about you know, supporting the artists, and to hear you talk about it in a festival context, in a you know, concert presenting context, and how that translates to broadcasting. I mean, do you see the curation of a festival stage and the curation of a radio playlist as kind of one and the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, for me, this is such an amazing time for music. Let's look at the positives. You know, the quality, and actually the sophistication of people's listening today. You know, my son, who's 21, who's been in denial that I exist for 20 years, right? Because he wants to find his way. But, you know, he can get to the music of Sun Ra in the space of a week. It took me a whole lifetime to get to where I'm at. And he's really just into sort of dark beat quartet, you know, sort of harmony groups at the moment, right? This is like 21-year-old London boy who smokes too much weed. and he's basically, and his sophistication in music is amazing, and so we have to take into consideration and really celebrate that, and we need to. So in a way, the music is amazing. We are there to be able to just sort of scream about it, and so we're in a beautiful position because we have the best music to go on about, to reach our audiences. So I think it's very positive. I just think we've got to be very, we've just got to really encourage and nurture the new generation. Just one other thing that I think is you were mentioning the Ezra Collective earlier on, and that they're in this playlist. One thing about all the British musicians that I know, they all DJ. They all do radio shows, right? So it's a bit annoying because they're getting some of the jobs. But what it means is that they kind of are so excited about it, and they're spreading that to their community. And I think it's that balance between, where the experienced broadcasters, it's about, that's what we have. We have years of experience of how to broadcast and how to connect, and we can give them that, and they can give us the energy, and it's about finding that place and the community.
I want to ask a question, and this is mainly to you, Giles, but really for everyone. How do you strike the balance between prioritizing discovery and keeping your sort of equilibrium with a broadcast audience? It can't be new emerging artists all the time. You really have to strike that balance. And how do you do that? Is it really like this organic intangible? You just kind of know it when you feel it, or is there a science to walking that line?
I'll say never underestimate the power of a good segue, first of all. I mean, you can actually lead people into different versions of the music, I guess to say, just by what you're playing and how you connect them. And sometimes that's with your voice in a break, and sometimes it's just with a segue. Yeah, I mean, that's my policy. I also sound like a manager at this point, but I also, I pay attention to the ratings. I care about those because it tells me whether or not the work that I'm putting in, the creative work that I'm putting in, is effective. So I mean, that's what you do. I mean, you do the creative work and you hope that you reach an audience, but you also should be measuring that and paying attention to those things and considering them if it's not what you think your intention is manifesting in a certain way. What can I change that is still me as somebody, who is trying to be creative in this field, but that will reach an audience. I mean, you've got to think about all those things. Mm-hmm. You should be.
I'm just going to say, I'm sorry. In the public radio space, in my experience, having been a broadcaster, I think about 20 years at this point, can't believe it. But it's interesting because as a broadcaster, really doing the work on the airwaves, I find or have found that in the public radio space, it's important that those that are donating are considered, or at least management wants to make sure that those that are giving the money, I'm being very honest, those that are giving the money are being served. And if those folks don't necessarily want to hear Ezra Collective, that isn't going to be played necessarily. They're going to be playing, those late great folks on repeat, because that isn't where the money is coming from.
You start to develop a certain attrition with that audience, though. So, for instance, when I got to WRTI almost 3 years ago, I looked at the numbers, I looked at the demographic, I looked at the age of the average listener. And so, as a programmer, I knew there was something that needed to be done You know, we needed to, you know, have new ideas, new programming. We needed to introduce things for other audiences, like the Friday mixtape that I do. You know, it's very different from anything I've ever done in broadcasting in 26 years, you know. But I'm specifically thinking about, you know, two audiences. I was talking to you about this, Matt. Yeah. You know, I knew that there were older people who enjoyed the 70s and Benny Maupin and CTI, Carlos Garnett, all that stuff, man, Don Cherry Records, you know, who were out in the world and were younger than our average demo. And I also know that there's an audience behind my generation, I'm 48, you know, who are discovering these things, like your son, Giles, you know, like, who are getting into these things in their own way. And I'm trying to kind of create that sort of, you know, that space where there's almost like a Venn diagram. And I'm trying to find where these audiences are actually connected and don't even recognize it, you know. And so I'm measuring it. It's currently working. Hopefully it will continue to. But, you know, like, you've got to, we're very conservative. Management especially, you know, in a lot of ways. I mean, I know that from working at WBGO for many years and trying to get the Checkout, trying to get the Vanguard series on. Those were not easy things for me to get accomplished, you know. And eventually the dam broke and I was able to do those things once they recognized that it was bringing newer people in, it was bringing a different audience, you know. But you have to have the willingness in those places in management where they can foster that, where there is a space for these things to grow, for these ideas, for newer ideas, for younger, you know, people who are just getting into broadcasting, you know, to give them some kind of space, but then also to impart all the wisdom that you've accumulated over however many years you've been broadcasting, you know, so that they're doing the work as a presenter, you know, that they're doing the work to entertain people, to engage them, you know, in ways that will connect them to the music in some way that they've not experienced just by, you know, going track to track. I mean, it's a different experience. I mean, I've been collecting LPs for 35 years now. You know, I have a completely different relationship to music and discovery than my daughter, who's, you know, be 17 this year. You know, it's just a different thing. And then when I find out what she's listening to, I sort of see how there are, in some ways, in my opinion, formative gaps in, like, though you're getting all this wide, you know, diverse, you know, set of sounds, which is amazing, you know, like, you're sometimes missing the connective tissue that a good curator can give to you, you know, and that to me is still one of the inherent, you know, powerful things about broadcasting, is that you can do that. You can, like, make these connections. Oh, you like this? Do you realize that it was a sample of this, you know, tune from the 70s, you know? I mean, for instance, I remember one night on Friday I played, you know, Power of Soul. I played Loran's Dance with Grover Washington and Idris Muhammad. And then, you know, I played, you know, Jahari Masamba Unit, you know, last track on there. And it's basically like chopped and screwed version of the same tune. You know, I had people emailing me like, what was that? You know, and I was like, yeah, you know, there's a source, you know. And for me, it's very important, especially as someone who cares about, like, the roots of the music and the foundation, which I very specifically say this is a black art form, a black American art form. You know, I'm not hashtagging BAM and all that stuff, but, like, I know where this music came from. You know, I grew up in New Orleans. I was surrounded by it. Doesn't mean that it hasn't done amazing things all over the world, you know. But, you know, that's the stuff that I care about, is finding those ways to draw those connections so that people kind of get the context, you know.
I just wish that there were more Josh Jacksons and Matt Fleegers of the world. I mean, the people that actually get it, who know how to draw in and understand the importance of really bringing in the next generation of listeners, because once those donors are dead, I'm sorry to say, what's going to happen next? We haven't catered or tried to bring in that next generation of listeners.
Well, I want to ask about a very specific initiative that addresses that, I think. Part of the title of this panel is In the Digital Age, and I know that KMHD is involved in an effort to really beef up the sort of, well, how would you describe it, Matt? It's like a playlisting digital initiative that has some funding and that you've devoted a lot of resourcing to reinventing.
Right, so we're part of a cohort that was funded by the Doris Duke Foundation, and they called it the Jazz Media Lab. And so inside this grant that they gave to WRTI and 3 other stations in the United States, they put a sub-grant inside there and said, if you can pitch an innovative idea, we'll give you extra funding to put this grant out. And what my director of audience development, David Stuckey, who's back here, and I have been working on, is we've been working with developers to create a sort of new streaming service that is a user-defined experience. So when you come to us right now and listen to our stream online, you're going to get whatever's playing on KMHD. Now, as program director, I feel like you're going to get a quality product, but you might not want to hear bebop right now. Maybe you want to hear some Brazilian music, you know, or maybe you want to hear Earth, Wind, and Fire. You know, we play these sort of things under our Jazz Without Boundaries format, right? So what I want to do is give our digital audience that choice to basically have my role at the radio station, where if you want to play program director of KMHD and listen to the shows in the order you want to listen to them in, you're going to be able to do that within this app. And basically, like you would do in Spotify, but instead of dragging tracks over, you'll be dragging shows over, and have maybe you go from our Brazilian show to the Soulful Strut, which is a show that examines soul, funk, and R&B. Maybe from there you go to one of our super heavy funk shows, or maybe you don't want that experience at all. Maybe you want a lot of Duke Ellington, a lot of bebop, and some Latin jazz in there, something like that. You'll have that ability with this app to do it. And you know, David's been really instrumental in this idea of kind of gamifying this app. So when our interface is complete, it will be fun to interact with. So you won't just want to search by genre, because not everyone has that level of knowledge, because jazz is so deep and wide, right? So maybe you're going to say, like, I want a blue mood right now, or I want a magenta mood. You'll have like a color wheel to pick from. Or maybe you want to navigate by era or something like that. So that's one way we look at, like, for a digital audience, we know what we need to give you if you come to us digitally is choice. That's what everyone expects when we're interfacing with things digitally these days. We can't do that on the radio. I mean, you can still tune into the terrestrial signal. It's always live. It's always happening 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. But the thing that I want, especially for our DJs, because each of our DJs comes with a different audience, right? They've got their peers, they've got their groups, they play out for people. Most of our DJs are in clubs occasionally, you know, or at least a couple times a month. So we want them to be able to say, like, here's my show, listen to it now. Bingo. And you just hit a QR code and you're listening. This app will help get us there a little bit easier, but also we hope, and the reason why we're in New York this week is if you like the Winter JazzFest and its programming, we play almost every artist on this festival. And the ones we don't play are the ones we discovered this week, and we're getting ready to program when we get back to Portland. So the whole idea here is we figure, yeah, well, maybe you might want to taste a little bit of the flavor we've got going on in Portland, and but also we love this city, we love the culture of this city, and you know, and while New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, you know, New York is the Mecca for me.
Philly's cool too.
Philly's cool too. Pittsburgh, a lot
DC
comes
for
through
that matter.
Pittsburgh.
Exactly.
We're doing.
Yeah.
You know, so I think I speak for everyone when I say I'm very fascinated to see, you know, as this comes together. And you know, when you first mentioned this, I think everybody sat up and said, "Oh," so I'm very excited about that. Yeah, do you need to bounce?
I have to go, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to that today.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you
us.
for thank you for joining us.
I
Thank you for
enjoyed
being
Winter
here.
Jazz very much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Keep it
thanks,
up.
guys. Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
Giles. We are very soon going to pivot to questions from the house, but before we do, I wanted to touch on one other thing, which is, as we talk about the state of jazz radio in the digital age, part of that involves the area that I inhabit. Because jazz radio in the digital age is also a journalistic, a narrative platform. And so we have podcasts in that space. We have the, you know, website articles, reviews, features. We have, you know, when I do a piece for Morning Edition representing WRTI, that's part of this proposition too. So I wanted to ask you how we're doing on that front. How are jazz radio stations stepping up to this moment? In particular, at a time when jazz magazines are, you know, struggling. most major newspapers have greatly reduced their coverage of this music. And so, you know, are we in a good position, and are we capitalizing on that position, if so, to step in and step up in that way?
Well, it's important for us to syndicate the journalists. I mean, we've got Ashley Kahn in here. We've got you, Nate. We've, you know, like Marcus J. Moore, somebody, you know, like that. I feel like every radio station that plays jazz in the country should be familiar with the people that are writing about the music, and should be talking about that too, because you know, you're reading a book while listening to instrumental music. The words on the page start coming alive, especially if you're reading about what you're listening to. You know, that's why we love liner notes so much, but also those mosaic box sets. You know, where you get the big book and you start looking at that while you're listening. It's just a beautiful experience. But I think the part where we're failing on this is and you know, again, I'm going to shout out David Stuckey because he has some good ideas on this. What we would like to see happen is if we could say to Ashley, like, hey, we got to give you a subject and say, like, write about this. You know, like, give us, you know, an opinion piece or something you just want to write out, and we just pay you for that, and we put it out there, right? That's an idea that we want to cultivate in the future, where we can start bringing in OPB, where KMHD is based, is Oregon Public Broadcasting. It's the NPR affiliate. So we also have a lot of journalists in the house where we're at, right? And so there's a journalistic bend at the organization. But it's not, we're trying to work on this arts journalism a little bit more than the hard news journalism that so much of public radio is pivoted towards. You know, public radio used to be feature-based, right? And now it's so much more of a NPR, CNN style thing. And what we would like to see, I mean, as the creative folks in the building, is more of that arts-focused, feature-focused journalism start coming back into public radio a little bit more.
I would say there are lots of opportunities for podcasting, very clearly. It's also an incredibly crowded space. You have to really consider strategy when you're doing this. And, you know, you have to consider, like, I mean, like, when I think about anything that WRTI does now, you know, we have a very clearly defined mission to champion music as a vital resource. We have very clearly defined core values, you know, in terms of curation, in terms of community, in terms of education. You know, there are things that we are thinking about deeply when we try anything. And so, for instance, I did a podcast with Jazz Denmark on the history of Danish music called Dangerous Sounds. You know, it's 8 episodes. It's like very intensively produced. There were lots and lots of effort hours put into the production and the distribution strategy and everything in order to make it out into the world and hopefully available for people to listen to at dangeroussounds.org. However, you know, but all that to say, you know, like, that was an intensive production, you know, and it took time, effort, and frankly money that was partially funded by Jazz Denmark. You know, we have a finite amount of resources like any organization, you know, and in jazz particularly, it's not nearly as well endowed as classical, and there's lots of historical reasons for that that we won't get into today. But, you know, all that to say that when you consider these things, you also have to say, well, what are the effort hours? What is the reason for this? Who is the intended audience? You know, how can I reach that audience? Can this be a kind of quick and dirty production, like one voice, you know, doing interviews and something like that? Or is this going to be this very elaborate narrative and storytelling mechanism? You know, there are lots of different things. I will say this, though, in terms of point of view, that's the reason why people engage largely in podcasting. They want to hear someone who has an opinion. And some people are rather loath in jazz to express their opinions about whether or not they like something or not. I feel a little less inhibited by that the longer I've been in it. But, you know, like, there's sort of a niceness, or just like, I don't want to get involved in some little jazz spat or something like that, you know, by saying I don't like something, when that's a perfectly reasonable thing for anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not good music or anything like that. you just like, I don't like it, and here's why I don't like it, you know. But to just have an authentic experience like that and to be willing to share that, you know, that's what a good podcast would be for me. I just want to hear somebody who actually knows what the hell they're talking about, has some, you know, has done some deep listening and some fairly extensive research so that they have a familiarity with the topic. You know, that's the kind of thing that I find important, and I think that's what's largely missing in the space. It's not that there aren't people doing those podcasts, but they also aren't supported by a mechanism of an institution, for instance, that has other ways, marketing and philanthropy, because if you're just going to podcast, it's not going to be enough. You can create WRTI studios all you want, you know, and we'll just throw one podcast after the next until we think something's going to strike gold. And good luck. You're going to spend a lot of time and effort, and then you're going to feel, probably as a creative person, nobody likes what I'm doing, you know. And the truth is, if you don't have a strategy to sort of engage, you know, bring people sort of in an engagement funnel so that you can continue to develop that relationship with them, so that you can market to them, so that you can let them know, you know, this is the thing that WRTI does, or, you know, whatever organization, this is what we do, and your support, you know, is what kind of keeps us able to continue to bring this. Like, you're not going to have, you know, you're not going to have everything in place that you need to keep something sustainable. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to the dollars and cents, people who have to look at those things and make sure salaries are paid, et cetera, you know, we are also looking for a great idea, but also something that is ultimately going to be sustainable, you know. And working in jazz, many of you probably know, not everything is easily sustainable, you know. A break-even proposition is sometimes a victory. You know, and if you can sort of make just a little bit above and beyond, you know, get ROI out of this in some kind of meaningful way for your organization, so that it allows you to keep working toward the mission that you have. You've got to be committed to an idea, but you also have to have strategy. You also have to have business acumen. You've got to have a lot of things in place. I wish that more and more people who love this music and are creating all these podcasts, who just do it for the love, I wish that they had some of that foundation, you know. I wish that they had that in place, you know, to sort of elevate their work, but also to give it some additional perspective, you know, from veterans, from people who understand audience and audience behavior, you know, like just the wisdom that has, you know, accumulated over decades of doing this and making mistakes, for instance, and learning from them.
What's interesting as a podcaster for me, and like you mentioned, it is a lot of work. It's a lot of work for no money. But I've given up. I shouldn't say I've given up on the money thing. Hopefully it'll come at some point. But what's interesting for me is that when I was in the process of auditioning and interviewing for stations about 6 years ago now, I got rejected. And I created my podcast, and I mentioned this before, out of rejection. And then it was once I created that and it started to get a little buzz around it, one of the stations that rejected me came back and was like, oh, we like that. All of a sudden, you know? So clearly there's value in the little podcast, because where, you know, major radio stations might not be playing these artists, their publicists are going to reach out to me and find out if they can have space on my platform. And so I think it's important that these larger radio stations recognize the importance of the little podcaster that could, you know?
That does.
I think we've probably got some questions burning to come out here in the room. So Ryan is going to be our who is the talk show host du jour? Who should we say you are today, Ryan?
Donahue.
Donahue. Oh yeah, there we go. That's the energy we need.
No Jerry Springer, please.
Steve isn't here.
So please direct your question to anyone, specifically or generally, and yeah, let's see where we go.
Don't be shy.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Derek Lucas for informing myself and Neil Sapper about this, because we're here for APAP, not necessarily Winterfest, and we didn't know about this, and we're both heavily involved in jazz radio. I'm Mike Doodle Gomez from KUVO Denver. You know as well, Mr. Jackson.
Yes, sir.
And everything that the gentleman from the UK said is very valid. We do that and have been doing it for years. Our slogan is community, culture, and music. And we're one of the few stations on the globe that still have live jazz broadcasts on a weekly basis. And now we have 2 performance studios, since our station moved about a year ago to a brand new state-of-the-art facility. And I don't believe that there's a decline in jazz radio. We're just in transition, that someone else said. And I went through this is the beginning of my 35th year in radio broadcasting of jazz and other creative music forms. And I went through the transition from LPs to CDs. And now we're going through the transition of CDs to digital music. And we play digital music. The only downside to digital music is the metadata, because that's part of jazz radio, and I know there's people working on that to put a metadata base for national use, where you can subscribe or just log on and get all the information you don't get when you download music, because then when you digitize it and broadcast it, it just gives you the artist and the title, no accompanist, no other information. So I applaud what has been said here today, and I just wish that this would have been further publicized to have had more radio people here in attendance this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious as to your thoughts about the state of diversity and equity in jazz radio and what is being done around that and its impact on the state of jazz radio.
I can speak to this a little bit from KMHD's perspective. So KMHD is the license for the radio station. Nate kind of alluded to this earlier. Is owned by a community college in Portland, but like so many colleges during the financial downturn around 2008, they started to lose some of their funding. They couldn't run the station anymore. And so OPB basically took over what was a license management agreement for the station. When they brought it over, they kept it as a volunteer radio station. And so for about almost a decade, the first decade that I worked there, it was a volunteer radio station. Which I consider to be a very non-equitable arrangement. But a lot of our peers, especially in music public radio, are volunteer radio stations. One of the first orders of business was to try and convince our parent organization that this wasn't an equitable situation. One of the things that we were helped along with the Doris Duke Foundation grant, which was designed, one of their sub-goals for the grant was to include what might be called DEI initiatives into the stations with the funding that they were giving. And so what we did was we established an arrangement where we took all of our volunteers that were producing content and said, we're going to give you ownership of your program, and we are going to develop carriage agreements, which in radio are sort of syndication agreements for these formerly specialty shows that we had. So these hosts now own the programs, they produce them, and we buy that intellectual property from them. And those are most of the specialty shows that we have on in the evenings. We pay on a per episode basis for these programs from folks. And the other great thing that we were able to do, and the reason I'm here with 10 other hosts at KMHD, is we've also installed finally a full staff. And the diversity situation is really important. You know, what Josh said earlier is we have to honor jazz as a black invention. But we also, back to that authenticity point I was making, if the person presenting the music is from the culture that created it, then we have a more authentic experience with presenting it. So, you know, one of our stated goals is to, you know, continue to grow the diversity of our station, to bring the voices into the station that should be presenting the music, and to create that experience. Portland is one of the whitest cities in America. And one of the things that has to happen with this is I think there's a real clamoring for an experience of black culture in Portland. And so some of our hosts have to step back and let others take the reins now, you know, to be able to establish this in a more authentic fashion. And so I see that as, you know, a key, crucial aspect of the diversity effort is to diversify gender, age, racial demographic, everything else on the air, and it needs to be balanced in a way that we can do this multi-generational boogie that we do on the air, right? We have to make this applicable to somebody who's 8 years old all the way up to 80 plus. And I think with instrumental music, it's very easy to do that. And the majority of the music that we play on the air is instrumental. So those are some of the efforts that we're making over the past 3 or 4 years. But I think like every station, we have a long way to go still.
I would say as a manager at WRTI, we're a service of Temple University, equal opportunity employer. I mean, Temple is very considerate of trying to find diversity in an applicant pool. I am as well as a hiring manager. I'm always looking for talent. I'm looking for talent. You know, I'm not specifically looking for a community, you know, or particulate, basically. I'm looking for talent, whether it's raw talent, whether it's polished talent. You know, I am, you know, mindful of, you know, making sure, as you said, that, you know, there is an authenticity to the experience and that, you know, someone who has been a part of that culture and that community has opportunities. You know, WRTI is a very powerful platform. So I want to give space for those voices. I'm also always looking out and listening to, you know, find someone. You know, I also know lots of people who've been doing this for a very long time as well. You know, so yeah, we have a very diverse community at WRTI. I mean, you know, my boss, Bill Johnson's a black man. I mean, you know, we have people on all aspects of senior leadership team. You know, if you really want to break down all the demographics of it all, you know, we are a highly diverse staff. You know, when I first joined WBGO, it was highly diverse staff in 2001. You know, I also think that just look at the music that you are presenting and unlock that. There's the key in a lot of ways. I mean, this is a highly diverse music. You know, there is a definitive strain, as I'm sure Arturo could talk about for many hours, of Latin jazz as a category, you know, but that has been embedded in this music from the very beginning. You know, there are different cultures that have kind of created, you know, a very valuable experience that we have all sort of appreciated as listeners, you know, and so I'm very mindful also as, you know, white guy, you know, that I should not be the only voice, you know, that there should be a multiplicity of voices, men and women, you know, and people from different demographics, you know, because that, you know, there's strength in diversity. You know, it's not anything that doesn't help.
I will say real quick, I'm sorry, Nate, that, you know, and what I'm about to say, none of these stations are represented here right now. But for some stations, I feel DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, only really became important until funding was attached to it. And so I think it's important that folks really have a genuine vested interest in DEI and what it means, beyond there being some sort of grant that can be garnered from it.
There needs to be authentic engagement, you know, like I have seen this very starkly in classical, because we are also classical, you know, and I've spoken to black musicians who have, you know, all of a sudden been engaged by major orchestras, you know, and I straight up ask them, you know, is this feel like hug a black musician for you, or do you feel there's a significant connection between what this institution is attempting to achieve in terms of their DEI calculus and what your art is and what, you know, you are trying to do.
Or am I a token?
Yeah.
I will
Those
say,
things have to be complementary.
I'll testify for a moment and say that one of the things that I was so pleased to witness during my time at WBGO, and this must have been tied to Women's History Month, but we put together this was pandemic time, put together a Zoom conversation, a panel discussion, and it was the women of WBGO. And this idea came about just thinking about Women's History Month and looking at the host roster, the announcers, and saying, look at this incredible concentration of talent, and it's, and we didn't have to try to put a box around it. It was already there. And so Keanna moderated this conversation. One of those incredible women broadcasters is here, Sheila Anderson. And I will say that this was like it was not a broadcast conversation. It was, it took place on social media, and then we put it on the website. But it was really wonderful to witness, just to see the sort of sisterhood, the acknowledgement of the struggle that, was a common, unifier, but then also some talk about mentorship, often from older male colleagues who said, you've got something, let me help you develop it. So it was, when we talk about DEI, that was an inspiring moment for me.
Yeah, same.
All right, so do we have another question?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having this. I listen to WBGO every single day. The community, the telling about events, your interviews, and your passion.
I'm no longer there, but thank you.
Okay, the passion that you have on the radio station is just amazing. My question is, someone mentioned that there needs to be more of a connection between the different radio stations, jazz radio stations, and like a sharing of ideas and collaboration. So I wanted to know if anything like that exists, or as a result of this conversation, would that be something that could come out of this? And then my second question is about connecting older musicians and younger musicians. Like, is there anything intentional that each radio station is doing to connect older and younger musicians? Okay.
As a matter of fact. Would either of you like to talk about the Jazz Media Lab for a moment? You mentioned it.
Yeah,
Matt.
the Jazz Media Lab is this initiative that's funded by the Doris Duke Foundation right now, and the stations that participate in it are KMHD, which is my station in Portland, KUVO in Denver, KNKX in Seattle, WRTI in Philadelphia, and WBGO here in Newark. So those are the 5 stations that are part of this cohort. But there are other stations in the country too. There's WCLK at Clark in Atlanta. There's my former station, KRTU in San Antonio, Texas. There are a number of other stations. And so what I think many of us, I was doing this in our last debrief with them, is I'm like, you need to bring more stations into this, because there are all these different stations that, and I think our strength is together. I don't see any competition between jazz radio in the United States at all. In fact, I think there's just so much we can learn from each other, but we all have these independent audiences we have to serve, and so we each specialize to some degree. Like WRTI has their own sound, WBGO has their own sound. All these sounds are unique. KUVO is an amazing station because they do so much Latin jazz programming, and they serve a really interesting community in Denver I know Arturo, we've been listening to you guys for decades and always doing amazing stuff in Denver. And so each of these stations has their own flavor, and there is this desire to learn, but there's also, we all know each other. Like, Derek's here, he's upstate New York, and it's like there's all these different jazz stations that are doing so many amazing things, but getting them noticed outside their individual communities, I think, is important, because I think some people, there are some people in Portland that want to listen to KNKX. There are some people in Portland that want that like classical jazz mix that WRTI can give. And because we're in the digital age, to bring it back to the topic of this discussion, I think you don't have to necessarily vote for your own regional jazz station. You need to vote with your taste, like what do you dig? And then find the place that delights you, but it's not so easy to find that place all the time, right?
After this many years, there's also, I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding among individual stations that, we're stronger together, that collective impact is especially important. Sometimes we're all doing good deeds independently, and we're, not necessarily harnessing the actual power of what we do. And, sometimes that is unfortunately limited, where someone who's doing something very interesting that should receive some more support is not getting it, And, that's a difficult thing. It's hard to change old habits, and, management in some ways is also responsible for, are we going to just like spend our bandwidth on focusing on our local community? We have all a limited amount of bandwidth, and we're all very busy, hopefully. So it becomes the question of, it requires some sort of external motivator, like Doris Duke in this instance for the Jazz Media Lab, to bring this cohort together. And then, even then, I have to say, among the five of us, we don't all play in the same sandbox sometimes. There are different strategies and objectives among different leadership at those stations, And so, you try to find ways where you can be in a collaborative space and have some, desirable effect or impact on building audience, or you just go it alone, but, the chances of, really kind of optimizing the effort is, sometimes lost.
You had a second part to your question, which was about older and younger musicians, and I will say that I think that's, first of all, organically what happens in this music. But I can tell you that when I've only been at WRTI for 4 months, but before I officially came aboard, one thing that I was very interested in was this collaboration that RTI had sort of invested in between a legendary Philadelphia saxophonist named Odine Pope and a soon-to-be legendary Philadelphia saxophonist named Emmanuel Wilkins. And Odine is old enough to be Emmanuel's grandfather, and they throw down and have not only been supported with coverage and that kind of support, but also been given rehearsal space and like considerable material resources that were at the station's disposal. And that I watched that happening before I came aboard, and I said, that's the kind of place I want to be. I'm sorry?
Somehow my phone just...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would say you have resources that, as an organization that, that aren't always financial, like, Nate said, the studio space. That's a thing that we do. We also have tons of studios, and I'm looking for opportunities to bring more people into our studios, to consider doing podcasting, to consider doing something that, they think is important, and that maybe, like, I can help shape, to be, something that can then be a part of WRTI. Like I said, for that, it's about community, one of our core values, to Philadelphia saxophonists, intergenerationally connecting. We did find some grant support to do certain things, but we also said, hey, come in, use the studio, use my, production manager to make all the recordings and to do videos of, what you're doing. And we'll figure something out that, we can then use to sort of mediate what you're doing to an audience.
Yeah, we have some folks in the stream that have a few comments and questions. Emily Springer wrote in, she said that the Jazz Media Lab has directly helped her learn about radio and podcasting through her work at WBGO. So there's people out there, and she's a young, very forward-thinking individual that's pushing the music forward in her own way. So glad to see her tuning in. Jamaluddin Takuma has been on the whole time.
Uh-oh.
So shout out to Philly. He has a question specifically about how people listen to the radio. He said, how many folks still have a radio in their house? He said, I happen to do most of my radio listening in the car. How has that impacted how you approach?
Sure. The majority of radio listening is still in the car. That's where we still have a captive audience in some ways, although that is also eroding more and more as people have the option to program what they want in their vehicles. Also radio has traditionally been a linear experience, so we do have the ability, which we use to archive our live capture, live broadcasting for 2 weeks, so we have a replay archive, but we are very heavily invested in promoting smart speakers, because the majority of people, they may not understand that they're listening to radio, but they know how to talk to a speaker and, ask WRTI to play jazz. And so, we promote that. There's a lot of people who, yes, they don't have the box top radio or something like that. But as I said very early in this, we have to remember that our future is also our past, much like the music. And so, we are the audio modality. That is the space that we typically have worked in. Now that we're digital, also print has become an important part of that as well in terms of the context and storytelling. But, in terms of listening to the radio, my daughter listens to the radio, but she doesn't have a radio, But it's also sort of connecting to, different, especially younger generations, and kind of just giving them a way to reach you, and then they can choose to accept or reject it.
Ryan, we have a question right behind you, too.
All right.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the gentleman. There were several comments that the gentleman from the UK made, and I'm just interested. We're parents. We have 5 children between 36 and 18, so we listen to jazz a lot, right? I don't know much about jazz. I know what I like. I know what I don't like. And he mentioned his son having a sophistication of jazz, and I wanted to know what he meant by that, because we discuss all the time that our children have access to vast amounts and they recognize what they hear, but to know what you hear, knowledge is not necessarily experienced. I want to know, are there discussions around how to help the younger generation experience the jazz that they have knowledge of because they have access to it?
Well, I'm sorry that Giles Peterson is not here to answer that question directly, but I think we probably have some thoughts here on the panel.
Well, that was the purpose of this grant. So that was their stated purpose, was grow the audience. And when we talk about grow the audience, what that usually means is making the audience younger. So our key growing demographic, which is about 30% of our audience right now, is the 25 to 34 demo, right? So, and that's by design, because we're talking to them and we want them to go see shows, So, I love going to see the more maybe classically presented jazz, which means we're sitting in an audience and we're clapping, when we hear something nice happen. But what I know 20-year-old me wanted to experience was that visceral, this is dangerous a little bit, and I don't know what's going to happen, and people are going to dance, and they're going to yell and shout when they hear something they like. For me, that's jazz. people used to dance to Duke Ellington, right? That's what it was for. That's what the music was for. And this music was for that, to, shake your ass. You're supposed to get out there and do something. It's like the whole thing with jazz as dance music, and that's the Giles thing is really important. The biggest importance with Giles Peterson is that he brought the house thing and melded it with jazz, right? House music, which is in the club, meld that with the rhythms of jazz, and you bring it back to its source of music that you're supposed to dance to. And so I think both things can be congruent. They can both be existent. But I think that younger audience is going to get a better experience from being in a packed club, and the artist might not be playing perfectly, they might not be the best, but they're improvising and they're bringing a heart to the performance.
To me, there is a generational point that you're making there, and I think that Giles was making as well, which is, if you are under, let's say, younger than all of us sitting here, there's a very strong possibility, it's really almost certain, that you listen with fewer genre restrictions, or demarcations than the generation ahead of you, right? And part of that is technological, part of that is the way that we access music now. Think about Winter JazzFest, those of you who've been out. If you were to approach this festival with an idea of, well, this is what jazz is supposed to be, you could get really frustrated with this festival. And I would dare say that the music that is registering with these excited younger audiences, sometimes it strays from the classic definition of what jazz is, but it has the spirit of the music and it's informed by the music. And so that I think has been a gap sometimes with jazz radio stations, which do have, as Keanna alluded to, many times the people who are actively supporting the station have been doing so for a very long time, and they are accustomed to a certain sound, a certain aesthetic. That is what jazz is to them. And when something comes along from outside that circle, it can be perceived as threatening. And this is where some of this other stuff comes into play. How can you contextualize it? How can you warm people up to it? The signs anecdotally, I feel like this is the most exciting time for the hazy edges. There's all this great stuff happening in the bleed between jazz and other musics. And that is, I think, where some of that, what he was saying about his son having like incredible insight as a listener, I think he was sort of alluding to that, this idea of like, I may not know what this is or what tradition it's coming out of, but I can hear it and I can make connections.
Right. It feels familiar in some ways, especially Sunra,
Yeah.
I don't think you always have to have knowledge to have sophistication, but I think that it is, you have a stronger kind of connection when you do have the knowledge, when you seek it out yourself or when you have someone mediating in some way to kind of give you an understanding of his or her particular knowledge and depth and experience, So I love that, my daughter is listening all over the map and then will come to me and ask me some question, do you know about such and such? And I'm like, well, yeah, I've been listening to that for a very long time, and so I say, well, what is it that you want to know,
Yeah.
And then I try to push her in another direction, and I do the same thing with listeners, I'm really just trying to kind of create an experience that is, you trust me, that you feel comforted in some way by whatever, my vocal inflections or what have you, or just my kind of silly personal, peccadillos that kind of come out through the microphone, all that stuff. It's just 100% me as a broadcaster and just 10% more of effort to kind of cut through the speaker and to kind of, push you as a listener into some direction that you've never been, and I find that if that happens, great, I've succeeded.
I think all of us listen to this music too to revivify our spirits, right? I mean, you feel, when you feel something soulful hit you, right? And so the other thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to disrespect our older audience by thinking that they can't get into Eric B. and Rakim, right? Because we have people, we play hip-hop on the air, right? And we see hip-hop as part of the lineage of jazz. And so we'll have people that call us up that are elderly and are like, I didn't know I liked that type of music, you know? And to me, that is the most heartening sentiment I can hear. Because again, we're doing that thing. And if I can take a young person and turn them on to Duke Ellington, then we've done our job both ways, right? And so it's that thing. You don't need to stay where you are. If you are at a show and you're over 60 and it is motivating you to feel that visceral experience, we don't have to live inside these boxes anymore. Like anyone can dance to something and let the music revivify them. Because to me, that is at its root what it's all about.
Discovery, you know, it's discovery. And you know, the majority of the lessons I've actually learned as a broadcaster come directly from the musicians that I've spoken to and learned things from over many decades of listening. You know, it's important for me to be a listener as much as someone who is engaged with listeners.
We are at time, but we have one more question.
Squeeze it in.